grain was cheaper, and they had to find other professions. You couldn't have all these little mom and pop farms anymore. And that trying to have inflation wouldn't, even if they got what they wanted, it wouldn't have helped. Because the prices they would have had to pay for what they bought would have been raised as well, so they would not have been helped.
Yes. Well, in my own case, when I first studied and bumped into the name of William Jennings Bryan, I was very, very critical about him. But then I read his biography and various stories about him, and he became a more sympathetic figure. So I have very mixed feelings about this. But one thing is clear: he was not knowledgeable about money and about economics. His knowledge was rather superficial. But as a person, as an individual, he had appealing qualities, sympathetic.
Well, he was also very famous for the Scopes monkey trial, where
the creationist.
Yeah, they were teaching
evolution.
There was the biology teacher who was teaching evolution. If I remember, this is also 30 years ago. But I think there was a biology teacher teaching evolution in a school south of the Mason-Dixon line, getting back to the Civil War, and that was against the law.
Yeah.
So there was a trial, and he was the high-powered lawyer from New York who came in to represent the biology teacher, and he won the trial, if I recall.
Yeah.
And so for that, I consider him a good guy. This creationism nonsense is bad news.
What was it called? The monkey trial?
Scopes monkey trial. And I don't remember the historical allegory as to why it was called Scopes monkey trial. I guess, well, because the biology teacher was teaching that we're descended from monkeys or apes, and to the creationist mindset, this was offensive.
Ben?
But don't we have evidence that both of these men got disillusioned with what they thought was right before William Jennings Bryan quitting his job after Versailles negotiations? And Woodrow Wilson, there's the quote after his presidency where he said basically, I've unwillingly enslaved a free country and put the power into the hands of a few.
Did you? Were you aware of this, Professor?
Could you?
William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow regretted what they had done after Versailles was signed.
Well, William Jennings Bryan quit his job during the Versailles negotiations, and he was pretty vocal about that this was disgusting and he couldn't go on in this administration. And Woodrow Wilson then, after his presidency, regretted. And
is this specifically the Federal Reserve that they regretted?
I think there's a quote that
Jennings Bryan, not specifically about the Federal Reserve. Woodrow Wilson was talking specifically about the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I think Wilson specifically referred to the Federal Reserve and had some sort of regret.
No, very specific regret.
Yes.
I've unwillingly enslaved the free people.
Were you aware of that, Professor?
Whatever I learned about this is that Woodrow Wilson considered his own career as a failure, and it was in a way, wasn't it? He was on the winning side in World War I and came home because he went in person to Versailles, the peace negotiation, and brought home a proposal, and then the Senate wouldn't accept it, including the League of Nations, you see, and some other things. So he became a bitter man, and I think he considered his own career as a failure. And it was. He was a professor. In fact, he was the president of Princeton University, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. And he abandoned his chair at the university to join politics. And I think you can see that almost in every category he was a failure. Certainly the Federal Reserve Act, which is nowadays very directly attacked by a lot of people. I'm a little bit more cautious than Ron Paul. I would also be very happy to see the Federal Reserve abolished, and Ron Paul published a book with the title "And the Fed." You see, and actually it has been translated into German, right?
Yes.
Recently, and that's the only book. Ron Paul has several books. Does everybody know who Ron Paul is?
Yeah.
He's running. He announced his candidacy for the president, next year's presidential election, and that would be marvelous if he got elected. Unfortunately, it's a long shot, and I'm not very optimistic about it. But he has written several books, and only one, to my knowledge, has been translated into German. I'm a little bit more cautious about the, summary dismissal of the Fed, because it didn't start out like the engine of inflation. It's simply not true. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was not all bad, but we are not going to go into that. I just mentioned my own position. I'm willing to admit that, for instance, it was on the basis of the real bills doctrine, federalism, and it just so happened that the war broke out within half a year from the signing of the Federal Reserve Act, and then here is Wilson's very big mistake. I think it was he, Woodrow Wilson, the president, who wanted to finance the Allied side of the war. Now this was violation first of the Neutrality Act. You know, he was not supposed to take sides. And number two, violation of the Federal Reserve law, because what happened was that the Federal Reserve law, the Federal Reserve banks opened their door for business sometime about almost to the day when World War I started. And they were supposed to build up their assets, which should have been real bills, short-term credit for consumer goods on the way from the producer to the consumer. And they didn't even look for customers, they just started, and that was done stealthily, not in public. And even today, I don't think they acknowledged the responsibility of Woodrow Wilson to start these new banks, 12 new banks across the country, buying government bonds, which meant loans going to the Allied powers, France, Britain, and the rest of them. This was a very underhanded and illegal activity. And then there is another thing about Woodrow Wilson, his involvement in declaring war on Germany. That was years later, I think 1917, and it had to do with the unrestricted submarine warfare which Germany declared against the Allies. Now you see, Germany and the Central Powers were put under blockade by the British. British warships prevented imports to Germany. And that was all right. But when Germany retaliated by declaring unrestricted U-boat warfare against the Allies, then, Wilson was up in arms.
Wasn't the U-boat World War II?
No.
World War I?
Sorry?
Never mind.
And then there was this Lusitania incident. That was a passenger ship on the run between New York and Le Havre, between Europe and America. And the German embassy in Washington, because that was before the war, state of war existed between the two, so there was an embassy in Washington, German embassy, wanted to put advertisements in American newspapers in the major cities all across America. And most of these newspapers, refused to run the ad. And the ad simply said that the German embassy is warning prospective passengers on the Lusitania, that was before the boat sailed, that under the terms of the unrestricted U-boat campaign, it could be a target, so they are risking perhaps their own lives. This was the message which these newspaper ads would have carried. And mysteriously, most of the newspapers, some got through. I'm not saying that none of these advertisements appeared. A few got through, but the great majority of them was never published. Now, how do you explain that?
Why were the Germans allowed to sink a passenger ship?
Because they suspected, with some reason, that they carried
troops, armed forces, okay.
Armament,
right.
Munition.
You
see? So under the cover of being a passenger ship, they could send ammunition to the Allied powers. There are several books have been written on that, and they documented this somehow. I don't know that this was actually the case. I mean, the Germans didn't just enjoy sinking passenger ships for its own sake. No, there was some military reason, such as this. And as I say, the theory is that Wilson wanted to join the war on the side of the Allies so badly that he, through his various strings, applied his influence on the newspapers not to carry certain ads. Sounds incredible, but that's the theory, that using various ways of persuading the newspapers of the country, these advertisements, which could have saved lives of Americans, were never published. I think this is a bad thing. I mean, the president trying to frustrate an effort to save civilian lives. Oh, by the way, why was it that, Wilson was frustrated in his effort to involve the United States in the war on the side of the Allies. Because the country, by and large, was neutral. Certainly were not anxious, people were not anxious to join the war, which was really a very devastating war up to that point. There was not so much bloodshed. And that partly had to do with the fact that the United States had a large section of the population of German origin. And people were not happy about the prospect of getting involved in the war. So what Wilson needed was a pretext or an excuse to declare war. And he wanted the Lusitania to be sunk, because that would change the feeling of the country. They would accept that really the United States had to get involved in the war. And so he was happy that the Lusitania was sunk. And unfortunately, apparently, the history repeated itself in 1942, right, when the Japanese
41.
The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and actually destroyed a whole fleet. And it seems clear, but really you have to know more about this as an expert. But, quite a few books appeared which suggest that President Roosevelt had advanced knowledge of this planned attack, unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor. And he prevented the commander-in-chief in Pearl Harbor to be notified. They broke the Japanese code, from which they knew the date and the direction and so on of these bombers to approach Pearl Harbor. And the information was not passed on to the commander in Pearl Harbor, which is really a terrible thing for the president to do. I don't know how many, but more than 1,000 young men, sailors, were lost because they should have been ordered to the shore, and they were inside of those boats which were hit and sunk. So a lot of sailors died, and to imagine that your president could have prevented your death, and he didn't. In fact, he encouraged, in a way, the Japanese to make that attack. Is a terrible thing. But we are really off the target, so let's, 5 o'clock. But if there are more questions, yeah.
Really?
I have a question about the Resumption Act.
About?
The Resumption Act.
Oh, yeah.
I find it incredible that such an act announcing that there's a return to redeemable money and giving the date, 4 years' time, when this is going to happen. I'd like to know what you think is the likelihood of anything like that happening again.
No, I don't see any likelihood.
Because I presume that you believe that we will one day return to redeemable money.
Yes.
And so, my question is, if not that way, which I agree is incredibly unlikely, how? It would be announced overnight, right? Or not 4 years in advance.
I really think it's so hopeless that through natural development, the powers that be would realize that this is inevitable. I think that before a lot of suffering, a lot of economic pain, which the country would suffer, and as a consequence, what I said earlier, blood would flow on the streets, and there would be a total breakdown of law and order. That my whole thinking has changed very recently. Now I think that it's far more realistic to say that it's not the gold standard we want a hybrid monetary standard. And in terms of the European situation, let's say that the danger is that the euro breaks down, the centrifugal forces overwhelm the system, Greece will go, Italy will go, Spain will go, and so on, and this will be the end of the euro. So this is something to be prevented, because that would be a terrible chaos in the European markets if this happened. And it could happen very quickly. First Greece goes, and then in very short order other countries would follow. I think this should be prevented. And one way of preventing it is, I gave a special lecture on that earlier, I think the second day, that if the leaders of the European Union got together and agreed that they have to prevent this from happening, then bailing out countries and banks and this and that is not the way to go, because it's like a endless sinkhole, a rat hole.
Black hole.
But what they could do, and with a very high degree of success, is I describe it as the revival of the Latin monetary union. And the result would be that they would take all the gold from the central bank vaults and put it into circulation. And this would add enough liquidity to the system that the government debt could be refinanced in terms of gold bonds, and the banking system could be saved, which in my view presently is insolvent. It's finished. There's no way it could outgrow of its difficulties. The situation is so advanced, the rot is so advanced that the banks, and that's not just in Europe, but also in the United States.
And in Japan. And in Japan.
Japan. The Japanese banks are zombies for decades. They are living corpses. It's just the government. In fact, you could say the government has nationalized the banking system. They are no longer viable banks. So this is a world phenomenon, and in fact this shows that the end will be pretty bad, because previously it could be that one bank goes bankrupt here, and then a little bit of quiet, and another bank, and then another. But it never happened that the whole world, every single bank, or the big banks anyhow, go bankrupt and become insolvent. So we can't even imagine what would happen under this, but this is coming, because they are already insolvent. It's just that this information is being kept secret by the government. To the extent that bank inspectors are instructed to turn their
Blind eye.
the other way when they see that here is a bank which overstates its assets and understates its liabilities, which is so widespread now. And the bank inspectors will not point this out and make it public and so on. This is what's going on right now. So, any more? Yes?
The creation of the Fed, 1913, were there any provisions about how they handle any potential profits? Because when they are profitable, they have huge profits from their operations or their losses. And if there are profits, who takes them? Do they go back to the 12 regional heads and then?
Yes. According to the charter, the shareholders of the Fed are individual banks. So that's private, okay? These are and they subscribe the capital of the Fed and got a fixed return of 6% per annum. That was fixed in 1913, and has been kept at that level all through. So when a lot of people make the point that it's a private cartel. I don't think anybody
Just
would
change the battery.
proposition to become, 6% is ridiculous. You can make a lot more if you're an independent bank. So that's not the key. The key is how the